Brad never thought he'd be the guy checking his wife's phone, but the late-night whispers, the secret messages, and the lies left him no choice. What he uncovered didn't just destroy his marriage, it changed everything. Brad had always believed that if his wife ever cheated, it would be simple: catch her in a lie, find the proof, confront her, and walk away. So when his suspicions about Carmen and her so-called friend Rick first crept in, he did what any rational man would do. He started looking for evidence. At first, he thought it was just about confirming what he already felt in his gut. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized that this wasn't just an affair. There was something else, something darker, lurking beneath the surface. And what he uncovered didn't just change his marriage, it changed everything. Brad had thought he was finally settling into a steady, manageable rhythm in life. Sure, working 10 to 12-hour shifts to support his family wasn't easy, but it felt worth it. He had a beautiful 2-year-old daughter, Ella, and a wife, Carmen, who, as far as he knew, loved and appreciated him. He was doing everything a husband and father was supposed to do. Then, out of nowhere, Carmen hit him with something he never saw coming. "I think I need a break from us." Her voice was so casual, so indifferent, like she was just suggesting they rearrange the living room furniture. Brad blinked, trying to process what she had just said. A break from us? What was that supposed to mean? He had been working himself to the bone to take care of her and Ella. Wasn't that what a good man was supposed to do? A break from what, exactly? He asked, keeping his tone even, though tension crept beneath the surface. Inside, frustration churned alongside confusion. Carmen wouldn't meet his eyes. "I don't know who I am anymore," she said. "Everything is about being a mom and a wife. I need space to figure myself out." Space. That tired excuse. To Brad, it sounded like the kind of thing people said when they wanted to leave without admitting it. His stomach twisted with disbelief. Carmen had chosen this life. She had wanted the marriage, the baby, the stability. And now, all of a sudden, she was acting like it had been forced on her, like she was some kind of victim. Brad took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Okay," he said carefully. "But if something's wrong, shouldn't we talk about it? Work through it together?" He hoped, prayed she'd say yes. Instead, she shook her head. I need time to think." That was all Carmen had to say, and with that, she left Brad hanging in limbo. Over the next few days, he did his best to respect her request. He cut back on overtime, made sure to be home more for Ella, and tried to ease whatever stress Carmen was feeling. Maybe she was just overwhelmed. Motherhood was tough, that's what people always said. But Brad didn't mind the late-night diaper changes or the sudden crying fits. Sure, it was exhausting, but this was their daughter. You just did what needed to be done. Still, something about Carmen's behavior didn't sit right with him. Instead of using this so-called thinking time to reflect or process her emotions, she was glued to her computer late at night. More than once, Brad had caught her in front of the screen, headphones on, laughing, really laughing, while chatting with people he didn't recognize. "Who are you talking to?" he asked casually one evening, keeping his tone light. He didn't want to sound accusatory. "Not yet. Just some friends from an online game," she replied quickly, brushing it off. "It's nothing." But the way she said it sure didn't feel like nothing. Friends from an online game? Since when was Carmen into gaming? As far as Brad knew, the only thing she ever played was the occasional round of Candy Crush on her phone. "New hobby, huh?" he said, forcing a chuckle. "Yeah, I needed something to distract me," she muttered, avoiding his gaze. Brad let it go, for that night at least. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Something wasn't right. His gut told him to start paying attention. And over the next week, things only got stranger. Carmen's phone was always in her hand. The moment Brad walked into the room, she'd tilt the screen away as if she had something to hide. She started staying up later too, long after he had gone to bed, whispering into her headset, her voice too low for him to make out the words. One night, as Brad lay awake, muffled laughter drifted from the living room. His mind wouldn't stop racing. Is she hiding something from me? He didn't want to believe it. They had been through so much together. But deep down he knew something had shifted. The trust they had built over the years was beginning to crack. Carmen's behavior wasn't just a small change anymore. It was a pattern. She was distant, distracted, completely absorbed in whatever, or whoever, was on the other side of that screen. Brad tried to be rational. Maybe she was just stressed. Maybe this was her way of coping with the challenges of motherhood. But denial could only carry a man so far. One evening, as Brad tucked Ella into bed, he heard Carmen's voice from the living room. Her tone was light, playful, almost flirtatious. Then he heard it. "You're too much, Rick." The soft laugh. "Yeah, I know, right?" Brad froze. "Rick, the same friend he had been suspicious of from the beginning. And just like that, everything started to fall into place. Brad froze. His instincts kicked in, his heartbeat slamming against his ribs. Rick. Who the hell was Rick? The way she said his name sent a sharp chill through him. That wasn't the tone you use for some random gaming buddy. No, that sounded intimate. Keeping his expression neutral, Brad stepped into the room. Carmen's reaction was instant, too instant. She clicked out of the call so fast it was like she had something to hide. Her head snapped up, eyes wide, lips stretching into a forced smile. Oh hey, I didn't hear you come in. Brad folded his arms across his chest, studying her. Who were you talking to? She shrugged, her tone casual, too casual. Just one of the guys from the game. Then, as if realizing she needed to reassure him, she quickly added, he's married. Don't worry. Married. Right. Because that makes everything perfectly fine. Brad nodded slowly, letting her excuse linger between them. He wasn't looking to start a fight, not yet. But something inside him snapped. This wasn't just his imagination. Carmen was hiding something. And he was done pretending otherwise. That night after she went to bed, Brad made a decision. Heart pounding, he reached for her phone. His hands felt clammy, his breath shallow as he started scrolling through her messages. And there it was. Message after message from Rick. Flirty jokes. Inside references. And then, the worst part, Carmen telling Rick things she had never once said to Brad. How Rick understood her. How he got her in ways Brad never could. Brad felt sick. This wasn't just a meaningless online friendship. This was betrayal. Sleep never came that night. How could it? Every word from those messages burned into his mind like an open wound. Carmen had poured her heart out to some stranger on the internet, making Brad sound like nothing more than an obstacle in her life. She felt trapped. Misunderstood. Unhappy. After everything I've done for her. After everything I've done for Ella. By the time morning rolled around, the shock had settled into something heavier. A quiet, simmering rage. He couldn't just sit back and let this continue. He needed to know the truth. No matter how much it tore him apart. And later that day, Carmen carried on as if nothing had happened. She smiled at Ella, scrolled through her phone, and went about her routine like she hadn't just shattered something inside of him. It was almost insulting how normal she was acting. Brad sat there watching her, his stomach twisting. He knew. And now it was time to confront her. Hey Carmen, he started, keeping his tone casual as they sat in the kitchen. Can we talk for a minute? She glanced up from her phone, her smile flickering for just a second before she masked it again. Sure, what's up? Brad didn't waste any time. He met her gaze head on. I need to know what's really going on, he said, his voice steady. With you and Rick. The color drained from her face. For a long moment she said nothing. Her eyes darted to the side, like she was searching for an escape route. Rick, she finally said, forcing out a weak laugh. He's just a friend. She swallowed hard. We play games together, that's all. Brad exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Cut the crap, Carmen. I saw the messages, he said, his tone calm but firm. I know exactly what you've been saying to him. Her face went completely pale. She opened her mouth, then shut it again, scrambling for a way out. Finally, in a barely audible whisper, she muttered, I didn't mean for it to go that far. Brad raised an eyebrow, his patience wearing thin. Oh really? His voice was laced with disbelief. So telling another man that he understands you better than your own husband, that's normal now? Carmen flinched like he had slapped her. I'm sorry, Brad, she murmured, her voice trembling. I've just been lost. I didn't feel like myself anymore, and Rick, he was just there to listen. Brad let out a sharp scoff, leaning forward. His voice hardened. Listen. He shook his head. You mean the guy you've been flirting with while I bust my ass at work to support this family? Silence. For the first time, Carmen actually looked ashamed. But Brad didn't care about apologies. Not anymore. Here's the deal, he continued, his voice unwavering. You want space? Fine. You'll get all the space you need. But you're not dragging me or our daughter into your little crisis fantasy. He held her gaze, unflinching. We're going to figure out how this ends, he said, his tone final. Because I'm done being kept in the dark. Carmen swallowed hard, her eyes brimming with tears. But Brad didn't feel sorry for her. Not after what she'd done. And deep down he knew, this was just the beginning. Brad had been crystal clear. He wasn't asking for much, just the basics. Respect. Honesty. Loyalty. Surely, after their confrontation, Carmen would wake up and realize the damage she was causing. Right? Wrong. The following week she proved just how little their marriage actually meant to her. Without so much as a word to Brad, she arranged for her mother Margaret to watch Ella. Then, while Brad was grinding through a grueling double shift, Carmen decided to sneak off for a date. Yes, a date. It was almost as if fate, or some cruel joke from the universe, decided to intervene that afternoon. Brad happened to be driving through town when he saw something that made his blood run cold. Carmen, sitting outside a cafe. With him. His grip tightened around the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. Brad? His coworker Kane asked from the passenger seat, sensing the shift in his mood. What's up? Brad's voice was tight. Just pull over for a second. Kane barely had time to slow the truck before Brad was unbuckling his seatbelt. As soon as they came to a stop, he jumped out, adrenaline surging through his veins. He didn't need to get any closer to know exactly who that jackass was. Carmen looked up, and the instant her eyes met his, her face drained of color. Rick, on the other hand? He barely reacted. He leaned back in his chair, completely unfazed, as if this was just another normal day for him. Cocky. Dismissive. Hey man, let's not make a scene, all right? We're just talking, Rick said, his voice slow and casual. Brad took a step closer, fists clenching at his sides. Talking? His jaw tightened. You think I'm stupid? His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable threat beneath it. You've been messing with my wife. Messing with my family. Rick raised his hands in mock surrender, barely hiding his smirk. Whoa, easy man. Brad's fury twisted inside him like a blade. You stay the hell away from her, he growled. Or I swear to God you're going to regret it. Carmen shot up from her chair, her face twisted in anger. You're a psycho, she screamed, her voice cracking. Brad ignored her. His focus was locked on Rick, the smug homewrecker who thought he could walk into Brad's life and take what wasn't his. Don't worry about our daughter, Carmen snapped. My mom's with her. Brad's hands clenched tighter at his sides. That wasn't the point. That was never the point. Carmen let out an exasperated breath. You're suffocating me, Brad, she ranted, her voice growing shrill. Brad let out a slow exhale, his anger simmering beneath the surface. Suffocating her? That's what this was now. All the sacrifices. The long hours. The unwavering loyalty. And she had the audacity to say he was the problem? Brad clenched his jaw, the betrayal settling in like a weight on his chest. This wasn't just the breaking point. This was war. I'm sick of you controlling every aspect of my life. I'm done. For a moment, Brad just stared at her, his emotions warring between disbelief and pure fury. He had expected her to deny it, to make excuses, maybe even lie to his face. But this was something else entirely. Carmen wasn't even pretending to be sorry. She wasn't ashamed. She was done, as if she was the victim in all of this. Brad exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Not even close. His voice came out flat, emotionless. Let's just get to work. But in his mind, the decision had already been made. Carmen had crossed the line for the last time. There was no coming back from this. That evening, Brad drove home, his thoughts an exhausting storm of anger and hurt. The image of Carmen sitting with Rick, laughing, like nothing in their world was falling apart, played on repeat in his head. He had told her this had to stop. He had given her a chance. And she had thrown it right back in his face. Pulling into the driveway, Brad let out a long breath, trying to steady himself. Ella. That's all that mattered now. He had to keep it together for her. But as he stepped inside, he immediately sensed something was off. His mother-in-law, Margaret, sat on the couch, her expression tense. She glanced up the moment he walked in. Brad, she said, worry lining her voice. I've been trying to call Carmen, but she won't answer. Brad ran a hand down his face, already feeling the exhaustion creeping in. Of course she wasn't answering. You're kidding me, he muttered, rubbing his temples. She didn't even tell you where she was going? Margaret shook her head, her voice thin and uncertain. No. I thought maybe she had just gone out to run some errands. But now I'm starting to worry. She paused, studying his face. Brad, what's going on? Brad hesitated for a moment, then sighed heavily. She deserved to know the truth. Brad looked Margaret straight in the eyes. Carmen's been sneaking around, he said, his voice firm. She keeps saying she needs space, like that's some magic excuse for cheating. Margaret sniffled, shaking her head. Maybe it's not as bad as it seems, she whispered desperately. Maybe she's just confused. Brad let out a slow breath, fighting the urge to argue. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the front door swung open with a loud bang. Carmen stumbled inside. Her face was flushed, her eyes glassy, and the sharp stench of alcohol filled the room. Brad's stomach turned. "Oh great," he muttered under his breath, crossing his arms as she swayed in the doorway. "Really classy, Carmen?" She let out a bitter laugh. "Like you'd understand," she shot back, her voice breaking. "You're both the same. Always trying to control me. Always telling me what to do like I'm some helpless child." Her eyes flicked between Brad and Margaret, burning with resentment. "I want freedom. I want space. And you," she jabbed a shaky finger at Brad, "won't give it to me?" Brad's patience snapped. "Oh, give me a break, Carmen." He let out a cold, humorless laugh. "Freedom?" He took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. "You're married. You have a kid. This isn't some teenage drama where you get to run off and play the victim whenever it's convenient for you." Margaret stepped between them, her voice tight with concern. "Carmen, stop this. Please just calm down." But Carmen wasn't listening. "No," she bellowed, her voice raw with fury, her eyes burning with hatred. "I hate all of you. You're all against me." Carmen shrieked, her voice wild with fury. She pointed a shaking finger at Brad, her entire body trembling with anger. "If you don't give me that phone, I'm leaving for good. I'll go to Rick and I won't come back." Brad didn't even hesitate. "Good," he roared, his voice echoing through the house. "Pack your damn things and get out." His chest heaved as he glared at her, every muscle in his body tensed. "I'm done with this. I'm div." But she was already gone. The house fell into an eerie silence. Brad stood in the middle of the room, fists still clenched, heart pounding. Slowly, he exhaled and sank into a chair, rubbing his face with both hands. Enough was enough. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out Carmen's phone. His fingers moved swiftly, taking screenshots of every message, every flirty text, every "he understands me better than you'd" comment, every single piece of evidence. She wasn't going to twist the narrative. Not this time. By the time he was done, the tension in his shoulders finally started to ease. Margaret sat quietly watching him. Brad let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "I get it now," he muttered. He looked up, meeting her weary eyes. "Take care of your daughter," he said, his voice turning firm. "But this is it, Margaret. I'm done. I'm filing for divorce." Margaret's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't argue. Instead, she wiped at her face and nodded solemnly. "I can't say I blame you, Brad," Margaret admitted softly. "But I need to ask for something." Brad eyed her warily. "What is it?" Margaret hesitated for a second before speaking. "Please, don't take Ella away." Brad let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. "I'm not out to take her rights away," he said, his voice firm. "But only if Carmen keeps her act together." Margaret gave a small, relieved smile. "Thank you, Brad. That's all I ask." Brad nodded, his exhaustion settling deep into his bones. "All right," he said, looking her in the eye. "But I need you to be on my side in court. If you want to be part of Ella's life, you need to back me up on this." Margaret hesitated for just a moment. Then, with a deep sigh, she gave a firm nod. "I will," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to go against Carmen, but you're right." Brad pressed a kiss to Ella's soft forehead, lingering for just a second. "Thanks, Margaret," he said quietly, handing his daughter to her grandmother. "I'll check in soon." Brad had reached his breaking point. He had already suspected Carmen was cheating with Rick, but something in his gut told him there was more to the story, something worse. So he made a decision. He was going to follow her. The next evening, Brad parked his truck a block away from their house and waited. His fingers tapped restlessly against the steering wheel as he watched. Then there she was. Carmen stepped out of the house, glancing down at her phone before sliding into her car. Within moments she pulled away. Brad followed at a careful distance, his pulse steady, his mind bracing for whatever truth he was about to uncover. After a short drive, she pulled into a dimly lit parking lot beside an upscale bar. Brad watched as she stepped out, her posture tense but excited. She wasn't meeting Rick. She was meeting someone else. Brad's grip on the wheel tightened. A man was already waiting for her outside the bar. Older. Well-dressed. Confident. As soon as she approached, he stood, greeting her with a familiar smile before pulling her into an embrace. Brad felt his stomach drop. Then he watched as Carmen laughed, brushing her hair behind her ear, her body language full of flirtation. The way she leaned in. The way she touched the man's arm. This wasn't just some casual friend. Brad felt sick. She wasn't just sneaking around with Rick. She was meeting someone else too. Brad waited, forcing himself to stay calm. At first, he had wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, Carmen was just lost. Confused. Searching for something she couldn't quite name. Maybe there was still a chance she would come to her senses. But this was who she was. It wasn't just one mistake. It wasn't just a moment of weakness. She had turned betrayal into a routine. And Brad was done. There was no fixing this. No second chances. No talking it out. Divorce was no longer an option. It was inevitable. His heart felt numb as he pulled away from the parking lot, leaving Carmen behind. The office was quiet except for the sound of Brad's lawyer tapping his pen against the desk. He had listened carefully, nodding occasionally, jotting down notes. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "We can definitely move forward with this," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Given what you've told me and the evidence you have, we'll get the paperwork started. You have a strong case for shared custody, with primary residence in your favor." Brad exhaled, a strange mix of relief and grief washing over him. It was painful. It was final. But at least he was taking back control. He signed the necessary documents, sealing the fate of his marriage in ink. Carmen stood across from him, arms crossed, smirking. Her eyes burned with defiance. "You think I'm scared of you, Brad?" she sneered. "Well, I'm not." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "In fact," she continued, "I'm relieved this is happening. Now I can finally be free." Brad let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, good luck with that." His voice was low, controlled. Then, with a sigh, he added, "Just be ready when the paperwork comes through. Stay in touch for Ella's sake." "Oh, I'll be ready," Carmen shot back, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You don't need to remind me." She yanked open a drawer, shuffling through papers, her movements sharp and impatient. Brad watched her for a moment, then turned to Margaret. He hesitated, then met her eyes. "But listen. I need you to testify if it comes to that." Brad's voice was steady but firm. "You've seen how bad things have gotten." Margaret let out a deep sigh, clearly torn. "I don't want to stand against Carmen," she admitted. "But if it's the only way to keep things civil, I'll do it. I don't want to lose you and Ella, Brad." Brad met her gaze, his voice filled with sincerity. "Thank you, Margaret. I really appreciate this. I know this isn't easy for you." "No, it's not," she agreed, her expression heavy with emotion. Carmen didn't show up. Brad sat in the courtroom, jaw clenched, as the judge glanced down at the empty seat where his wife should have been. She had sent some half-hearted excuse, something about an important obligation that had prevented her from attending. Brad scoffed under his breath. "An important obligation," he muttered. "Right. More like another excuse to avoid responsibility." The judge didn't look impressed either. "I don't appreciate when one of the parties decides not to take these proceedings seriously," he said, his tone dry and unimpressed. "Given that Mrs. Eddington has failed to appear, and based on the evidence presented, I am granting Mr. Eddington's petition." Brad exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling as the weight of the moment settled over him. He had won. But it didn't feel like a victory. His terms had been simple. He wasn't trying to take full custody, he just wanted what was best for Ella. And the truth was, Margaret had been more of a mother to her than Carmen ever was. He turned to her, his voice softer now. "I appreciate everything you've done." Margaret wiped a tear from her eye and nodded. "I'll keep helping however I can, Brad." And for the first time in a long time, Brad felt like things were finally falling into place. "You've already done more than enough," Brad said with a small smile. "But I won't say no to the extra support." Over the next several months, Margaret became a constant presence in Brad's life. She helped with meals, babysat Ella, and even attended doctor's appointments. But it wasn't just about Ella. She and Brad were slowly building a foundation, one of trust and stability. Carmen sat across from Margaret, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I messed up." Her eyes shimmered with guilt and regret. "But I want to change. I'll do whatever it takes." Margaret studied her carefully, searching for sincerity. Finally she spoke. "All right. I'll help you. But there are conditions." Carmen nodded quickly. "Anything." Margaret's voice was firm. "Then you need to get your life together. Find a job. Take responsibility for your actions. Rebuild trust, with your daughter and with Brad. No more excuses, Carmen." Carmen wiped the tear-streaked mess from her face and nodded. "I will." Brad, who had been standing quietly nearby, kept his expression neutral. "I'm glad you're taking steps to improve, Carmen," he said, his tone measured. "Ella deserves a mother who's present and responsible." Then his voice hardened. "But let's be clear, this isn't about us getting back together. That ship has sailed." Carmen flinched slightly but nodded. I understand, she whispered, her face falling for just a second. She knew. There was no going back to the family life she had destroyed. As for Brad? He focused on what truly mattered, Ella. And with Margaret by his side, he finally felt like he was building a future worth fighting for. In the weeks that followed, Brad settled into his new normal. Life as a single father wasn't easy, but in a way it felt lighter. There were no more late-night doubts, no more gut-wrenching suspicions. No more Carmen. With Margaret's help, he built a stable routine for Ella. Daycare drop-offs, bedtime stories, weekend trips to the park. He was finally focusing on what mattered. And Carmen? She did what she always did, made promises. She got a part-time job, attended a few parenting classes, and even showed up occasionally for visitation. But Brad kept his expectations low. He wasn't about to let her back in, not after everything she had put them through. One evening, as he was tucking Ella into bed, she looked up at him with those big, trusting eyes. Daddy? Brad smiled. Yeah, sweetheart? Are you happy? The question caught him off guard. For so long, his focus had been on surviving, on keeping everything together. He hadn't really stopped to think about himself. But as he looked at his daughter, his reason for everything, he realized something. He was, maybe not completely. Maybe not in the way he once thought he would be. But for the first time in a long time he was free. Brad kissed her forehead, tucking the blanket around her. Yeah, baby girl. I think I am. And as he turned off the light and closed the door behind him, he knew. Their story wasn't about what they had lost. It was about what they were building. Together. 10 years later. The autumn air was crisp as Brad sat on the bleachers, watching the soccer game unfold. His daughter Ella, now 12 years old, sprinted across the field, her ponytail bouncing as she chased after the ball. Brad couldn't help but smile. She was fearless. So much had changed in the last decade. He had gone from a man drowning in heartbreak to someone who had finally found peace. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. After the divorce, things had been rough. Co-parenting with Carmen had been complicated. At first, she had tried to stay involved, showing up for visits and making half-hearted attempts at fixing things. But old habits died hard. Eventually, she faded out of the picture, her visits becoming sporadic, her promises turning to excuses. It didn't take long before Margaret became more of a mother to Ella than Carmen ever was. And Brad? He focused on being the dad Ella deserved. He worked hard, built a good life for them, and over time he even learned to trust again. He glanced down at his left hand, no ring. Dating had been a slow process. He had been cautious, unwilling to risk bringing someone into Ella's life unless he was sure. And then one day he met Sarah. She had been a friend first, someone patient, kind, and understanding. She never pushed, never made him feel like he had to rush the healing process. And eventually she became more. Now she sat beside him in the stands, her hand resting gently on his. Ella's got some serious skills, Sarah said, grinning as she watched the game. She's going to be a star. Brad chuckled. She already is. The whistle blew, and Ella's team scored the winning goal. Brad stood, cheering louder than anyone in the crowd. Ella turned, her face glowing with excitement, and ran straight toward the bleachers. Dad, did you see that? She beamed. Brad opened his arms, catching her in a tight hug. Of course I did, kiddo. You were amazing. As he pulled back, he saw pure happiness in her eyes. And in that moment he knew. Everything they had been through, every struggle, every heartache, had led them right here. To a life full of love, laughter, and a future worth looking forward to. It had been 10 years since Brad had watched Carmen walk out of their lives. For a while, she had tried to pretend she was in control, acting as if she had won some great battle for her freedom. But freedom had come at a cost. At first, she bounced from one reckless decision to the next. New men, new jobs, new excuses. Her time with Ella had been inconsistent at best, full of broken promises and last-minute cancellations. Eventually, the visits stopped altogether. Carmen had always been good at running away, and for a while she convinced herself it was everyone else's fault. Until one day she had no one left to blame. Present day. Carmen sat alone in a small run-down apartment. She was older now. Her once vibrant energy had been replaced with exhaustion, and she reached for her phone, scrolling through old pictures, stopping at one that made her Ella. A little girl in pigtails, smiling up at the cam. But that wasn't who Ella was. Now she was 12, a young Carmen knew nothing about. At first, it had been occasional texts, missed birthdays, and now she was a stranger. Her thumb hovered over the call button, but deep down she already knew. Ella didn't need her anymore. She had Brad. She had stability. And what did Carmen have? Nothing. No family. No real friends. Just an endless string of mistakes she couldn't take back. For the first time in her life, she had to face the truth. She had thrown it all away. And this time there was no one left to save her. No redemption. No second chances. Just regret. And the crushing weight of everything she had lost. The end.